So this is starting an engagement. We did in the past, we had talked about the attitude and capabilities of coaches. I still haven't totally moved those into the book. The book we're actually building dynamically online in a Google Docs. So you can get it, but there's a lot of garbage in that. So what I did is I took a copy, took out all the comments, which just get in the way. It's not 100% complete, but if you go to the ACE materials, being an effective value coach for ACEs is there, and it's basically a Word document. This is the book, okay? So I'm going to be excerpting things from the book. Everything I'm showing you is in the book in one form or the other. So some places you'll want to go. There's a lot of good stuff. I've never seen a book like this because just a little background in the book is Paula, my co-authoress, and myself both have an experience with a few organizations that a lot of people have done. For me, it started with us as it did for her. And then both of us went into what's now Landmark, which is the next generation. I'm not active anymore. She is. But I studied a lot with Fernando Flores, who had a big impact on me and on speaking. I would say a lot of my training techniques and how I think about things is based ultimately on his work in languaging. And people have written about this. There is a book called Conversations for Action about Flores's work, but I've never seen anybody take it into how to coach. They've used it actually how to sell. I took some master sales course. I can't remember. Took it a couple of times. Quite good. But they don't offer this anymore. I mean, he stopped offering this stuff years ago, decades ago. Kind of stopped in the 90s. He was Chilean. He went back to Chile. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant man. Um, so you don't tend to see the stuff I'm about to talk about. And it's kind of been interesting that I started this book uh, talking about like coaching techniques and how you, not techniques, but how you can see what to do. And then with uh, when Paula joined, we got more into the actual speaking of things. So I don't know if I've never presented what the way I'm presenting it today, so I'm not quite sure if I've got time to cover everything, but let me show you what I'm planning to do. The intention here is what do you do when you start an engagement? And I don't mean starting an engagement from the doing part. I mean starting an engagement from setting the stage for the engagement, the being relationship part, okay? I'll be doing the other stuff we've been talking about the engagement model, but this is how you do it as a coach. Uh, and I've kind of probably added a little bit more than I should, and I want to actually have some interaction with examples on this. So I'll get through the important things, and I might not get through the other ending things, and we'll either cover it later or it could be a self-study. But for me, the starting engagement when I envisioned this originally was just going to be how I have conversations with people, and I will get to that. But it's important to add some distinctions that are not very common. And one of the biggest one is this notion of listening as a noun. Okay, and I'm going to go into this more, but just as a precursor, if you're hearing your own voice in your head, that's what I'm talking about, the voice in our heads. And what's active listening and what I'm going to call active speaking. As far as I know, I created this term. I can't find it anywhere. And I was thinking, what is this that I do? And what is this that I want you to be able to do? And it takes training. And it's actually the way you speak is intentionally designed based on how they will listen to it. Not just how do you hear them to get an empathy, but how do you speak so they will hear you better. To understand this, we've got to look at filters, triggers, blind spots, fundamental attribution error. In other words, how people are kind of wired. People are wired a particular way, and people sometimes think, oh, we're irrational and we're not predictable. It was interesting that in the choice, he said Goldratt, in response to his daughter, said, no, people are incredibly predictable. It's just that they're not rational in the sense of what's necessarily in it for them. Okay. Uh, any of you who have a relationship, when your partner asks you how you look or what this looks like or something like that, chances are you know how they'll respond if you respond in certain ways. Okay. That's an example of it. How do you open the dialogue? This is where I started, actually. This is what this session is about. How do you open the dialogue with people? But to do that, I think needs these things. You need to be aware of what's going on and how they're going to listen to the dialogue and why you have to open the dialogue in a particular way. And I may not have a chance to get to creating a path forward because, and this isn't quite maybe on topic, so I might just skip this. And it's written up, and I've even got a podcast on it. But so I might skip that if we run out. There's a lot of confusion about standards and explicit workflow. There's this negativity on standards. Standards are good. I mean, like a standard that says we won't put something out on a client's machine unless people know about it, or it could be something that there's a difference between the two. I want to talk a little bit about that. And then what are the elephants in the room? And there's an exercise, the clean slate exercise. Again, I'm really more interested in these first 5 lines, and definitely I'll have to get to the elephants in the room because that's part of opening the dialogue. Okay. So the thing is, again, it's important to understand how they're listening to you. Much of this can be anticipated. Acknowledging it is a good step. I've gone into places where I knew how they were going to respond to that I was an agile coach coming in. I knew they didn't like it. Oh, another agile coach. Expletive deleted in there. You've got to know that, and you've got to be open to it. You've got to talk about it. And you've also got to know it's not about you. It's about their past experience. You got to kind of clear the room, clear the space, as we call it. Okay. So this is really an important concept. It's the notion of listening. I don't mean listening as a verb. We all know that. I mean listening as a noun. So he talked about people's listening. Like you might be wondering, what is he talking about? That's your listening. That's what I'm talking about. Or, boy, that doesn't make any sense. That's also your listening. So listening is usually a running commentary about what you're hearing. That's actually a nice way to say it. Like that's a better way to say it than what I've got. So I'm gonna just say that that is really what it is. It's listening. Listening is a running commentary about what people are hearing. Is a person's. Now, the thing that's important is they don't hear what you're saying. They hear their conversation about what you're saying. Can somebody give me an example of what I'm talking about so I know you're understanding what I'm saying? We don't talk about listening this way, but isn't it common? Yeah, Kurt.
I got an example. So my partner's dad is semi-retired and is struggling to find work, for example. And I say to my wife, I don't want to end up like your dad. And what she hears is, I'm not doing enough. I'm bringing your career to a halt. So she reacts from that place of she's triggered. She reacts and she hears what's in her head versus what I mentioned.
That's right. You just brought up another important concept, triggering. So what happens is when you say something and then you trigger something based on past experience and fear as well. So that's not what you meant, but that's what you heard.
Yeah.
So you have to be very clear. So active speaking, see, active listening is kind of you're paying attention to what they're hearing and you're in empathy. Active speaking is an attempt to not do those triggers, to be aware of these things are going to happen. It is a kind of empathy, but it's now in the speaking part, not in the hearing or listening part. Yeah, that's a great example, Kurt. So this is something I haven't heard much, but it's very, very, very important. You can't really coach well without this. That's not true. Take that back. You can coach well without this, but with this, it gets a lot easier. And you're a lot less intimidating to people because the active speaking will help you not trigger people, and the active listening will help you notice you just did. So these two go together with it. Okay. So active listening is, just a way of listening and responding. In fact, I like what I just said too. Active speaking helps you lower the triggers. Active listening lets you know when you've hit them. And triggers are things, since we've mentioned that, let me just I'll get to this in a minute. Triggers are when something unrelated just happens. This is an automatic response. I've heard this called a tendency or a thrownness. In other words, you don't think about it. Here's a trigger that we've all experienced if you've driven a car. Somebody cuts you off. You don't ask them, I wonder if that guy's a jerk or not. Maybe he isn't. Maybe he is. Oh, I think he is. No, that doesn't happen. It's just that guy's a jerk. That's the trigger. And it happens probably from early childhood. It turns out that a lot of these triggers come from when we were growing up. There are actually, the psychology has shown that they happen sometimes when you're really infants, even barely speaking, if speaking. And then when you're older and you're starting to create your identity, and then as a teen, and then as a young adult, and then as an older adult, we have events that hit us and we tend to make decisions about it. Okay, so active listening, we've heard, I'm just restating it. I'm trying to get into empathy with the person to understand why they're saying what they're saying. So active listening could be, I'm looking to see why they're saying what I'm saying, but active speaking is attending to all this. And I'm trying the active speaker will be attempting to mitigate any triggers. In other words, you're actually taking responsibility for how people are listening to you. Now, you don't take responsibility. We talked about this in the earlier session. Responsibility is not blame. It's not, oh my God, I just triggered that person. No, okay, I just triggered that person. Great. Now what can I do about it? You see the difference? When you do this, you don't have to get into the, oh my goodness, what's happening? So I'm sure you've done this, right? When have you done active speaking? There may not have been a term for it, but I know you've done this at times. What's an example of you or attending to how you would say something to somebody based on how you were anticipating they would react to it?
Again, I go back to my relationship, Al. I want to have a meeting about budget. I want to look at our expenses this Sunday. If I'm aware of her own fears about scarcity, I can say something, like, I'm really committed to our financial future and I'm feeling some fear up for me. Just want to acknowledge that and let's sit down and look at the numbers. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's
So
good. There are other things you do. Actually, one idea just came to me. So I'm a recovering workaholic, which means I still am, but I'm at least noticing it. And we have this really beautiful house, and it needed some landscaping, love, and gardening and all that. And I was going to hire a gardener, but I didn't really like how I already have a gardener, but I didn't like how they had done some of the bedding. So I wanted to take it on, but I have a history of starting things, getting real enthused, and then not getting. You've seen this, right? So, but I really wanted to do this. So I talked to my wife and I said, look, honey, I know I have this history. So here's what I want to do. Give me a month to see how much I can get done. And I'm going to do it as a sequence of little projects. Okay. And by doing that, I was speaking directly to our relationship in terms of how I worked and what I said and all that. And in fact, I used to garden a lot, so I know a lot about it. I just hadn't been doing it. And since then, what I do is I do little bits, I do little projects that are fun for me. I've made it a habit not to go beyond fun, not to go when I'm tired, not pushing on. And our yard looks so much different. We have flower beds, we have borders, things like that. But that's the other aspect of this is like what Kurt said, you can set up the conversation, but you can also make a way to get like, okay, here's your test. Here's your way to tell me if I'm not being appropriate. Um, and yeah, good relationships have this, like we've learned to see when we trigger each other and then talk about it. Okay. Uh, okay. So filters, we all know about filters, but they're different kinds of filters. It's how we use the world. Some people call these part of our paradigm. It's what we think is important, but it's also what we believe we're seeing based on our past judgments. In other words, a trigger is a kind of filter because you now see what's result of what just got triggered. Your listening is taking place. But I love this quote by Edgar Schein, which I have kind of over here. This is a joke, where the guy's looking for his keys here because the light's better. This is like what we think and talk about. But so our mind filters what's around us by changing how stuff comes in and by looking at certain things and ignoring other things. Now, in the agile space, both of these are important. Can somebody give me an example of that? And I love your examples, Kurt, but I would like somebody else to. Yeah, Susan.
Go ahead, Susan.
Well, sorry, voice isn't quite here today, but just using the word status. What's the status of this? What's the status of that? Can make people extremely defensive if they've been given an unworkable schedule.
Yeah,
that's where you get to the 90% done per 6 months.
Yeah, that's my favorite saying is the first 90% of the work takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% of the work takes the other 90% of the time. But no, this is a great example because this is both the trigger and the filter, because now they're not really listening to your question. They're listening to all this, oh my God. See that conversation, and it becomes a biological response. Flight or fight comes into play.
And a similar thing happens when you're in a fear-based organization and you're trying to explain how things are going to be different. And I'm not even talking about development necessarily, but say with the end users. You're going to make me use a new system. They're going to want to have the same efficiencies that they had before, and I've not seen it before, and I won't see it until the day it happens.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually just wrote something that relates to this. I didn't occur to me it could help my thinking, but I realized I could probably add this slide that I wrote this morning. The biggest shift of Agile is we no longer hear that's the way we've always done it. What we hear now is that wouldn't be Agile, that wouldn't be Scrum, that wouldn't be safe. Notice that all of these have to do with safety, have to do with fear. I don't want to talk about that. They don't say I don't want to talk about that. See, this is part of the whole thing here with listening and triggering. They don't say they don't want to talk about it, but do you see how this is a defense mechanism, as this is a defense mechanism? It's exactly what Susan was saying. Does that make sense? So when you start seeing this, notice you can have a conversation with somebody when you understand this is what's going on with them. Now, have you ever had the case? What happens if somebody has this fear? Have you ever talked to somebody that they have fear, but you don't notice it yet? And you keep pushing. What ends up happening? So take a situation where you eventually realize they were afraid, but you didn't realize it at the time and you kept pushing on it. What happened? Is there a pattern here?
Well, basically, communication stops.
Communication stops. Does something else happen? You're right. Absolutely. Communication stops.
And they're not going to listen to anything you have to say either.
That's right. And what if you keep pushing with all that? Oh, I'm sorry, Patrick, you can say something?
Anger sips in. They begin to resent you.
Yes, that's actually, everything Andrew said, but I really want what Patrick said. I should add this too. I note that when you don't pay attention, see, this is another fundamental law. When I say law, it's like just what happens is underneath fear. Underneath anger is fear. So if you keep ignoring the fear, the anger, the resentment is a kind of anger. You did this to me. I'm mad at you. There's a judgment. Resentment is kind of a judgment that I'm getting this happening. So now this is useful. two ways. And I'm chuckling because the obvious way is listening to them. But if you ever get angry, man, I used to have so much anger in me. And it would be brought out actually in family a lot. We still a joke in my family, dad's tone. You know, I mean, I can make people feel stupid just by the tone, literally the tone of my voice. And what I noticed about 28 years ago, remember it was in 96, 97, maybe it was 27 years ago, but it was one of my first real consulting gigs. I used to do consulting and deciding what software to write, but I was never doing one-on-one consulting. And I would get angry at this particular person. And it was very inappropriate on my part. And I was just lucky that she was nice and just kind of scoffed it off. And her culture had a little bit to do with it, that men have the right to get angry. I don't, but I was lucky that I talked to somebody like that in that culture. And I looked at it, and what I saw was it was always fear. I was afraid if she didn't get it, I was going to lose my job. This is my first consulting gig, and I had that fear. So fear is a symptom, both from them, and you can avoid it by attending the safety issue, and also yourself. I actually written a chapter on this in the book. I'll add a slide about this since I've mentioned it, about fear. I'll add a slide to the topic.
One of the things I think as well is that resentment, I just wrote this in the chat, but resentment is really a signal that someone doesn't feel they've been respected. So
very often, yeah.
The fear is that you're not going to take me serious. You're not going to give me credit. You're not going to respect me. You're not going to take my opinions on board. So, like F you, but that's the response to the fear.
Yeah. These are great comments, but I was looking at what you and said. Yeah, it is kind of like walking on eggshells sometimes, Kurt. You've got to be continuously getting feedback and be very careful about it. But, I got it. Yeah. Again, Andrew, you're interpreting walking on eggshells one way, and I'm interpreting it a different way. So this just illustrates why conversations are important. It's also why questions are good. That's brilliant. I just think that's hysterical. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm about to get into it. Safe and Scrum, filter how we view the world. Yeah, Susan.
I was going to say that there's a concept of psychological visibility, which is that it's basically that the other person feels if that you see them, that you are treating them as a whole individual, so to speak. And if people don't feel visible in that sense, they will often say increasingly outrageous or angry things to get your attention that this is important and you're ignoring it.
Any of you have kids or been a kid? We learn to do this, right? As we learn to put our boundaries up and push back. Acting out has a lot to do with this. Yeah. So this is what you're stepping into as a coach. Actually, this is what you're stepping into as a human being. But if you're a coach and you're trying to make a difference with people, understanding this is going on is really, really critical. Okay. Yeah, I love this because these, what's really nice about this conversation is I'm presenting these as separate concepts, but you see how each one brings up another couple of them? This is where it can get very confusing. This is where you need feedback, quick feedback. This is where being face-to-face has some advantage because of body language, but you can also get this through the interactions. It's really the speed of the interaction and the quality of the interaction. Okay, so I already did this. So blind spots, we all know about blind spots. It's a special kind of filter we're unaware of. People sometimes talk about this as there's stuff we know, stuff we don't know, and stuff we don't know we don't know. And that's a blind spot. It's one of the reasons I love the interactions we have here. You obviously see me with blind spots every day, every session. But see, I know I have blind spots. So my response to when people point out I have a blind spot, at least in this session, because I've got it to be safe, is, oh, that's great. I've learned something. Believe me, it doesn't always happen that way. What do you mean? Sure, I understand. What's wrong with you? Uh, yeah, and the laughter is recognition. By the way, that's another thing to be aware of. This was also, I got this from Flores. He said people laugh when they hear something that is unstated but recognized to be truthful. That's what's kind of funny when you kind of say a joke that's got some human nature, and it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, and that's funny. So that's good to have that humor. Okay, here's another quick thing: the fundamental attribution error. It's like, again, go back to that car. So they cut me off. See, when they cut me off, they're jerks. When I cut them off, I'm on an urgent need and somebody is really in danger if I don't get there on time. So we attribute actions to other people as who they are, whereas with us, it's the situation. Somebody else have an example of that?
It's hard to come up with just one. Like,
Yeah,
mean,
you know, when you smiled, that's kind of what I thought you meant. And so the thing is, here's something that you can't tell people this, but you should be aware of this. All of these things are automatic and you have no control over them happening. Or you actually technically do have control, but not in the moment. If you study this years later, you'll see it's improved. If you're lucky, months at a minimum. What you do have control
This
is
attribution-
noticing this happens and not take action on it. It's like, so, well, I'm actually a pretty nice driver now. My wife sometimes remarks that what a nice driver I am. Believe me, I drove 2 years in Boston. New Yorkers don't. People are worried about New York drivers. New Yorkers are horrible, but they're predictable. When you add horrible with unpredictable and incredibly good skills knowing where your bumpers are, you got Boston drivers. I moved from Boston down to Florida back when it was a lot different and mostly old people. And man, I was so obnoxious. And I would notice I was obnoxious, but it took me years, decades to get to it. And the way I did it is I would just notice, oh, that automatic reaction. Oh, wow, look what you did there. Oh, you wouldn't let that guy in when you could have. I wouldn't beat myself up. I would just notice the instant reaction. And that's the thing to do, is to just, you have control in that last bit. That's where your freedom is. That's that last inch. Okay. Now, there are actually a couple of different definitions. I was looking at her book and I realized I had one, and I think they overlap with each other. There's this idea, there are two ways to think about bounded rationality, and they relate to each other. So I'm not going to read that. I'm going to just say what I've read and heard. So this one's actually a right one, that we actually are only partial rational and partial, based on the information they have, the cognitive limitations. See, this is the important piece. People cannot understand everything. I can't understand everything. Nobody can understand everything. I had a great conversation with Luke Holman once about what I was trying to do in this workshop. And he said, Al, it's a fool's errand. I didn't like to hear this, especially from Luke, because he's somebody I really respect. So when he tells me it's a fool's errand, I got to believe he's right, and I'm the fool. But what he meant was that even if I could get everything figured out, remember that Excel sheet we're talking about, don't expect people to be following that. They're not capable of following that. That's not the point. The point isn't to get it all out there where people will follow it. The point is to have at least a baseline that we can learn from. And we know that it's beyond people's ability to understand everything. And that's where they throw in their emotions. So there's limitations of understanding. There's also emotions. Okay, they'll make satisfying choices rather than optimal ones. We've got to be aware of this. This is, people tend to have a higher, they think they know more than they do. We've seen this all the time. A lot of experts aren't really experts at all. This is part of the problem with certification in my mind. I'm not really sure what to do when you run into this, except what I try to do In fact, I have this in the book too. I didn't tie these two together. I just got that. Is have them walk through. Okay, but let me set up saying, any questions on Dunning-Kruger? Have you've experienced it? I think this is pretty common. Has anybody, when they've run into this, what is it you've done to try to improve things? What do you do? And Kurt, you can talk about this one. This is a tough question. I know Kurt. Kurt and I've got a long term, even though I just joined here, we used to work together, and I know he's really deep in coaching. So anybody, but it'd be good to get an example. How do you solve this issue when you run into it? Because remember, they're the expert, not you, in their listening.
I mean, through your interactions, you subtly put facts before them that make them realize they're not as smart as they're putting out to be. In a way,
Does that work for you?
you gently humble them without forcing resistance.
Yeah, if you do it in a nice way, and I could believe, Patrick, with your personality, this could work. I'm not sure it'd work for me. Yeah, and why are you always agreeing with it when I'm self-defacing, Andrew? I'm not sure I like this.
No, I was just saying that it wouldn't probably work for me very often either.
Yeah, probably not. But it's
My
interesting. I
patience
love what
level
you
is
said, Patrick.
low.
I'm not at all doubting what you said. But I noticed that from you, because you've got this non-threatening, easygoing personality.
No,
I
it
don't have
took
that personality.
it took years of getting there. I
I
used to
okay.
fly off the handle.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, that's
I
encouraging.
used to fly off the handle.
Maybe in a few years I'll get to that point. Uh, but this is another interesting point. So there are different techniques based on your own personality. I wrote a chapter in the book, which is I take what they say, and then I let them draw it out to their own conclusion. Like the example I gave in the book was this guy who was using bad coding techniques. I knew they were bad. This was not one of those understand where he is and see what the right thing is. I mean, I really know about cohesion and stuff like that. And he was talking about how he liked throwing everything in a class. And I knew this was wrong. But I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere by pointing to facts with this guy because his whole identity as a programmer was wrapped into it. So I asked him, I said, well, how is that? How's that working for you? He says, oh, it's really great. Because at the beginning, I see everything and all that. Now I knew that was what he was going to say, because that's why you use this. I said, oh, and what's it like? See, I know what cohesion will give you and what it won't give you. I know eventually it's going to be a problem when he goes back to look at his code even. So I asked him, well, what's it like when others look at the code? Or what's it like when you look at the code months later? So I let him draw the conclusions. So maybe it's a blend of what, Patrick, you and I are saying, is that I do look for the facts, but then instead of explaining them, because I'm not that gentle, I let him draw the conclusion by going down his own path. Okay, there's a chapter in the book. I'll put these things. Okay. So we're getting close to.
Another thing is choice of language.
Oh,
You see,
absolutely.
a lot of people get carried away and say things like, "Oh, that makes no sense." There's nothing more annoying than that statement to who you're talking to.
Yeah, that's right. So, see, this is one of the things that we're presencing here. Is something I learned from Flores's work. Okay, if he worked a lot on, he expanded a lot, Being in Time by Heidegger and Wittgenstein's work, which I found incredibly obtuse. I tried reading both those books, and they're worse than Eastern philosophy, which actually I can read, but and understand. But these books I couldn't. But the idea that Flores was presenting was that people create their reality in their speaking, their listening rather, and how they hear things and what these filters are. So they create their reality, and you're part of their creation process by what you say. And this is why active speaking is so important. Because you have to pay attention to what's going to happen. Okay. So yeah, actually we're okay. Like I said, we're going to get to a certain point. I'm going to skip some things, which we can do later or do it in the Q&A session. So this is something else I got from Fernando. What makes an expert an expert? And people talk about experience. And it's not experience. Experience is useful. This is one of the things I think seriously messed up in the agile space, is because everybody talks about empiricism, experience, what we've seen. And it's useful, but it's not the key. And he would talk about distinctions, like this is different from that. And you hear on LinkedIn that I'll point out, or other people will point out these things as if they're different things. Oh, they're not the same. I mean, they are the same, they'll say, instead of saying, I don't see the difference, which is a much more open conversation. Now, be aware of that. If you say something is different and they say they're not, what they're saying is, I'm right, you're wrong, there's no difference. Instead of acknowledging, maybe they don't understand that, I prefer to say, I don't see the difference. See, that's on me now. It's not saying there isn't a difference. I don't see the difference. Can you tell me more about it? It's a much more open framing. Experts have more useful ones. Okay. Less competent people use poor ones or the wrong ones. Okay. Distinctions are what's really critical. Experts will see things that others don't. And I put that skier there because you see, there's a lot to know about snow. Me, I got 5 kinds. I don't know, about 5. Is it yellow? Okay. Is it good snowball making? Can I drive on it safely? Is it powder? I do used to ski. I know powder. But see, expert skiers probably have 5 kinds of powder. I've got only 1. Is it snow? I shouldn't let my grandkids play in because it's slushy, and my goodness, there will be a mess to clean up. See, distinctions are what we find to be useful, and we want to learn more about them. This is very critical. And to me, this is what I like to think about it as. A novice doesn't have many. It is, as we learn how to do things, we get more and more distinctions. Can somebody give me an example of this for yourself, where you have things that others don't, or others have things that you don't, or just in the world? Yeah, Susan. You're mute. You're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, there. I've been in a lot of situations where I've been brought in for something that has fallen apart and nobody can figure out what's wrong. And one of the things that they may have dealt with are people who don't know how to test. So you have developers who say, if they get a bug report, it's in back, works as designed. And frequently it's because there weren't proper requirements to begin with. But part of what I often do is say, well, there's this particular situation that seems to be a bit anomalous. And I checked with business and they say it should be this way and the system is doing it that way. So could you explain to me what's going on here? Because I don't understand it. I call it my Alice in Wonderland approach. There's all these strange creatures doing ridiculous things, and I'm just observing and saying that, well, this is different from this. Could you help me?
Yeah. Yeah. Asking questions is a great way, because when you ask a question, let's look at asking questions. First of all, if you ask a question, you're actually putting them in the stronger position so they have less fear. You're actually saying that you don't understand instead of challenging them that they don't understand. So there's respect. You respect somebody when you ask them questions. Of course, that's not like, well, why could you possibly think that? That's not a good question.
Yeah.
But so this is really good. See, this is the other point. Look at, like, when waterfall, we're looking at predictability. With agile, we're looking at the ability to respond quickly. So this is the key thing. Novices not only don't see certain distinctions, they look at the wrong ones and they've made up their mind. So it's a kind of filter. These distinctions are a kind of filter. This is why first principles. This is why I keep going back to first principles, because they're somewhat universal. I love this quote by Einstein I just found yesterday. Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. This brings up something also very important that I'll add a slide on: competency. I don't know where it's like in other countries, but in the United States, and I suspect virtually most Western companies, industrialized companies, we have this thing called an intelligence quotient. How intelligent are you? And there's one measure, and it's typically based on your ability to do logical thinking and solve problems. This is a real mistake and a real problem, and a coach has to get over this. And this is where a lot of arrogance comes from. This is something you got to be aware of with developers. Speaking as an ex-developer, we think we know more because we've got higher IQs than the rest of the people, and they're stupid. But actually, it's the developers that are usually creating horrible to use software. And it's kind of this arrogance. So intelligence can only be measured in a particular domain. A great example is Bobby Fischer, very intelligent chess player, not so good social. My wife and I were known as the high-tech, high-touch couple. High-tech, obvious with me. At the time we were started dating, I was programming, I built software, all that. And she was a massage therapist, actually an admin in a massage school, a school counselor. But I never considered myself more intelligent than my wife, and not out of survival. I never have. Yeah, you got a problem solving math, come to me, don't go to my wife. Absolutely. You got a computer problem, come to me, don't go to my wife. But if you've got a problem talking to people, being a parent, keeping calm, go to my wife. She's much more intelligent in those domains. So you're only intelligent in domains. Fish aren't very good about climbing trees, but they're pretty good swimmers. This is important because you're going to be talking to people about this. Okay, so I'm finally getting to the opening dialogue. In fact, I should add this. I just got it something else. I thought I had it somewhere. Oh, I added it in the book, but I didn't put it out here. Marcus Buckingham wrote a very good book called The One Thing You Should Know, and then he has some subtitle about 3 things you need to know. I've always thought it was funny, title and subtitle. But he talks about the difference between leaders and managers. And I never heard anybody talk about this but him. I'm sure there are. But leaders, he talks about as being able to create the vision and supporting of where we're going. And managers, and I know in the agile space, this book was probably pre-agile, but in the agile space, we don't manage people and things like that. But very often you do assign people to certain areas. And there is this thought about self-assignment and all that. And I really like that. Forget a guy's name. You know, what is it? Fast Agile? Anybody remember his name? It's really good stuff. I like the guy a lot. He's very smart. And it's about how teams self-organize even across multiple teams. And that's good when you can do it. You can't always do it. But his idea is like managers have to recognize people are not like checkers. See, checkers are pretty much every piece is the same until they get king preps. They're like chess. Some people like to do things different than others. Sometimes problems are that people are having to work in a way they're not good at working. Very competent. This is another quality, you could say, intelligence. Give one quick example, and then I'll move on to the real meat of this. So I had a guy who was really, really good, personable, smart, knew a lot about TDD, good XP person. This goes back like 15 years at Net Objectives, 20 years. He was like ideal and wonderful. I had no complaints. And but I noticed, so I'd give him one thing, and then I always like myself, I like to see what's coming. So I would give him a second. You don't have to work in this now, but here's this other thing. You know, if you can work it in, that's great. I noticed whenever I did that, his performance on everything plummeted. He just couldn't keep 2 things in his head at the same time, even if I told him not to worry about it. See, what was good for me to kind of think ahead and in between breaks and all that was disastrous for him. So I stopped doing that. I would give him one thing and said, hey, when you're ready, come to me and I'll give you the next thing to work on. Then I would let him figure it out. But sometimes just even letting people know what's coming for some people or telling them about it. You know, I think I did have a backlog where you could look if you wanted to. But this also points to the danger of trying to manage jobs to people because you don't know this. So when you could set it up where people can self-select what to work on, not just how to work, that's important. Okay. That's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, by the way. With Andrew had asked these great questions about pull, and I'm going to work through the whole pull system going from simple to full, you know, full company. I've been thinking about it to be very useful. Okay. Okay. So this is the meat of the session today, but I felt that if I didn't go through all those other things, we couldn't get to where it is. When you're walking into a conversation, you want to know what other experiences they've had because they're going to get triggered. They're going to have filters. They're going to say, oh my God, not another agile coach. Or, oh my God, not another non-agile coach. Or, oh my God, not another non-programming coach. You put it in there, they're going to figure it out. Or just really, oh my God, not another coach. So I always talk to somebody in the company, not the people I'm going to be meeting with, but somebody else. And I look to see what are these people's attitude. Be prepared for a negative reaction. Because if you know you're going to get one, you can handle it. I sometimes handle it when I'm not prepared, but I virtually always handle it when I am prepared because I take a deep breath. Oh, I know it's coming. I'm not really in survival. I go through a little running monologue there. This is key. It's not about you. It's about the past. When you walk in and they don't like you, they don't know you, but they know who you look like to them and they're listening. Do you see how I'm speaking? I'm active speaking. I'm attending to their reaction that I can anticipate. Questions? This sound useful? Yeah. Yeah. Now, it might be nice to make a checklist here, but I don't know that there is such a thing as a checklist. It depends a lot on your personality and who you're walking in, but I think just being aware of it. Okay. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them. So I have two stories I typically tell. And I hope I've said this in this workshop, but this thing runs on so long, I probably said it. So one thing is to remember it's not about you, it's about them. So this is kind of basically the dialogue I got. It says, hi, I'm Al, here to help you in your organization, but I want you to know this is not me leading this because that's what they're already expecting. That's what I'm there for. So I say, no. Yeah, I have a lot of experience. I talk about how I'm lucky. I came up with this when I worked at Net Objectives. I was CEO, had a lot of really smart people working with me. I get to see all this. You don't, that gives me experience and all these patterns, but I don't know anything about your company to speak of. The least experienced, I often bring this up, the least experienced person in your company knows more than I do. In fact, I remember one time I said this, it was Monday. And when they had done introductions, one of the people said they had just started working on Thursday before. Let's call him Frank. And I remember pointing to Frank. I said, Frank knows more than I do about your company. And everybody laughed because they knew it was true. See, laughter is good, not just because, you gotta write something about laughter. Laughter is not good just because it lightens the mood, which it does, but it means you've hit something that's true. That consultants aren't the experts on everything. Our least experienced person in our company knows more about the company. Okay. You ever do other people do things like, in fact, I just realized I didn't mean to go right into these. So before I go into the second one, what other ways do you guys break the ice? What do you do? Because I have another way as well, but I want to hear from you. What's your opening monologue, so to speak?
Well, I mean, the way that I kind of approach this now is a little different than the way I used to, but because I've done so much in the marketing space at this point, really, I think there are a set of questions that you can ask yourself and based on your experience and things so that you can be prepared for a lot of the fears they have, the things that they're afraid that you're going to expose that they're uncomfortable about and beat them up about and whatever else. And then you can use those to, put together in some kind of opening thing like this. So I don't necessarily have a set one, but I kind of have a structure, which is the same structure you use when you're coming up with like an offer or an ad or anything like that about, what are the beliefs that they have about the situation you and what they think you're going to do with them, and what stories do you need to tell to help mitigate those and shift those beliefs so that you can really come up from a fresh perspective from their part. So that's kind of my general approach. But I mean,
Yeah.
it ends up being, you summarize it into some sort of intro like you've got there.
Yeah. Yeah, Kurt.
Yeah, I love what Andrew's saying, and I like to just go in and just frame it as we're exploring the fit here. We may conclude this conversation. I may walk away. This may not be a fit. And so it kind of sets the stage for open dialogue and hopefully some trust to build. That's just
Yeah.
one thing I'd add. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that because I was thinking one of the things I think I left out that was evoked by Andrew's conversation was it was acknowledging also that there may or may not be a safe place. You can ask them questions, they may not respond safely, but Kurt, you exhibited bravery in what you did, and that actually creates safety for others when you exhibit that. Hey, I could say I might walk away. Oh, well, that's out of the ordinary. So exhibiting a safe space in yourself opens up the process for others. Okay. So yeah, that's good. So there are a lot of ways to do it. I think this is for me, the purpose of this is, look, I am not the expert here about everything. Yes, I know things. That's why I'm here. But you know things. So however you do it, that's really one of the key things. Now, this is something I think is important that I do that I got from Flores. One of the things he talks about is assertions. We talk about this in the book. He has language down to 4 types of constructs that everything comes out of them. One of them is a promise. I can promise I'm going to do something. The word promise is a promise. See, it's funny, but see, if I showed you a picture of a cat, it's a picture of a cat. It's not a cat. But a cat, the word cat is not a cat. It's a word representing a cat. But a promise is a promise. I promise I'll do that. Well, I just described the promise. It is the promise. And I request. That's a request. And a declaration, I can declare it's a pretty day because I'm declaring what I think. I'm really saying I think it's a pretty day. Or when a judge says you're guilty, now you're guilty because of that. And there's a 4th kind, an assertion. An assertion means I'm saying this is true and I have evidence to support it. See, if I'm saying this is true and there's no evidence, then that's just an opinion. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've said a lot of stuff about first principles and things like that. These are assertions. So I let people know this. I say, I'm going to be making hypotheses or assertions, but you'll present the evidence. I tell people this, normally when you say, I think this is true, then I'm supposed to provide the evidence. But see, I know that they have experience, unless they're pulled off the street, which I've never walked into. People have experience building stuff. That's why they were hired, or they've been learning it there. So I say I'll be talking about assertions, be making this, I'm saying this is true. It's like an hypothesis, but I want them to explain why it's true. And what's interesting is they either can, which means now they believe it. They don't trust me. Or they can't, which means, well, maybe you give me an example, or they disagree, in which now we can have a conversation. And I talk about, maybe I could be wrong. That's happened. I could have misstated something, or you may have misunderstood me. There's a good joke in this. The good joke is never trust a consultant. I'll always throw that in here. I should put that in. And everybody laughs at that one. I say, and I don't mean that they're not motivated, because my experience is most consultants are motivated. I mean, don't trust what they say to be true, because they should be able to either explain why it's true or you get it, or they don't have that ability. You need to understand it. So this is opening that dialogue for them to understand what you're saying. So what other things did you have here that, this is what I do? What other opening comments? You've seen my 2. And you've given me some, but are there others, especially about this, who knows what's true?
I think one of the things that I thought of that I forgot to say earlier was if you can in your listening early on identify things that come back to the Einstein quote. So, you seem to be good at X, and then you are creating a respectful interaction with them by acknowledging something good about them before you're going to potentially go ahead and challenge them on some other thing, so that you've proactively identified and acknowledged some things that they're good at, and you're acknowledging this, that everybody is better at something than somebody else. And if
That's
you
right.
don't come in with that attitude, then I mean it's exactly what you said, but I think I've found it very useful, if possible, in very practical ways, to say, pick up on something, and then it helps open that conversation and establish rapport, so that, it's because it's all about that. It's credibility and trust at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to go further. I thought the next two sections I wouldn't have time for, and I don't. I'll just continue them on. There are two other pieces. One is, but I want to do something else for a couple of minutes. I am going to talk about how I decide the path I take to guide new concepts, because that's an important part. I call this the pickup six. I think I've talked about that before, but in the coaching track, I want to do that again. And the other one is an exercise called the clean slate, which is a way to kind of get all this garbage out on the table. Like, what's the elephant in the room? Okay. But let's take a couple of minutes and use the chat, perhaps. We're trying to establish something here. We've talked about some of this. We're trying to make it a safer place. We're trying to make it where people feel respectful. We're trying to make it where they don't feel forced. What are the other outcomes? In other words, if I was to say, what is the outcome we want in this initial conversation with the people you're going to be coaching? What are the things you think we need to get? I just mentioned three: safer space, respectful, not forced on. And you could break those down into other things, like what does being respected mean? Oh, I like that, emotionally and intellectually safe. So let me just read these for somebody who's listening, although this chat should be there. Create meaningful exchange of information, increase flow of authentic and real information, vulnerability, bravery, interconnected, feel emotionally and intellectually safe so they can admit there are things they don't know without feeling like they'll be seen as stupid or even potentially getting fired in the future. You could have the old, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. I talk about that a lot. In fact, that's funny. I'd forgotten I do that. Is I make it clear to them that they have a safe place where they can tell me things and I won't convey it to their management. Could be a good thing. We'll figure out what we need to know. New information coming is safe. I'm a catalyst. Foster culture of shared exploration, then consultant teaching top down. There's another thing I remember I used to say. So one of the phenomenons I see is that management brings a consultant, then listens what the consultant says, even though he's been hearing this from his team the whole time. I acknowledge this. I say, look, this is what's happened a lot. Managers are going to listen to me more than they listen to you. That's not fair. I'm not saying it's fair, but it's the reality some of the time. Or I'll ask them if that's happening. And I say, so if you want them to hear something, tell me, and I'll tell them. And then I'll say it came from you if you want me to. So there are things like that that you can do. Yeah, no, it's not too late. Oh, you're just saying it's never too late. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's good. You're working on their behalf, not against them. So this is the last thing I sometimes do. I don't always do this because it's got to have a safe space, but sometimes I'll ask them, what do you want to happen? Well, I usually ask them it anyway. What do you want to have happen? What do you don't want to have happen? But I don't necessarily trust the answer. So that's something else I do. I'll tell you why I don't trust the answer. And they're not lying to me. They just may not feel safe to say what they want.
Yes.
But I like to ask that question. I like to ask the question because at least it got asked. And even if it's not a safe place for them to answer it, they heard me ask it. Okay. I'm going to update the slides with this stuff. This is a good conversation, and I'll continue. These things are in the book. I'll continue this thing about the pickup sticks. This was actually a really good technique for a coach when I was put in a situation where I felt like, man, there's no way I can do this, and how I figured out how to do it, and then I did. So this is a good technique. It's maybe not the first conversation, but we'll do this next Thursday. Remember, this session goes from Wednesday morning up to this point to starting to go Thursday morning. It's just more sustainable instead of having 3 straight days to have a day off. And that's why that's there. Same Zooms, all your sessions that are learning sessions, and the Monday morning, and now it'll be next week, the Thursday afternoon Zooms are all the same. Again, I'm going to talk about standards and rooms. Okay, anything to say in closing? Okay, good. I like this. I think this is an important piece. How you talk to people is really critical. And again, don't forget about this book. I'll be updating it every now and then, and I'm hoping we've got about another 10 days, and then I got to massage it up and all that. That's under the, if you came in late, under the ACE materials, it's being an effective coach. This is a preliminary copy of the book, should be published in another few weeks, and this time really will be published in another few weeks. I know I've been pushing off, but I've got a day-by-day work schedule. Okay, take care. Good session. I'll talk to some of you. This Q&A, just to let you know, is going to be taking it like step by step what a pull system is, going from one person to across an organization, because I've never explained it that way, but it becomes a lot clearer when I do, or when I will. Okay, take care. Good session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
All right.
Thanks,
Good
Al.
one.
Good.
Bye.
Take care.